various sources of these dynamics. And actually what I would like to focus on, these are the sources of the dynamics of democracy which are placed beyond democracy itself. That's why I will concentrate mostly on functioning of other than democratic institutions, showing how they influence the functioning of democracy itself. There are popular views that in post-communist countries, including this country, Poland, societal participation in democratic institutions, in democratic mechanisms, is pretty weak. Low electoral turnout, low level of party membership, low and pretty poor quality of parties functioning. These are the examples of such things. And actually, this is also associated with the complaints about the shape of civil society. That civil society is also particularly weak in post-communist countries, low level of non-governmental organizations, involvement, and low level of social activities related to civil society. And these are two popular views about the weakness of democracy and civil society in post-communist countries. However, I would like to oppose these views, and I would like to present some other opinion that instead of talking about the general weakness of democracy and civil society in post-communist countries, including Poland, we should more focus on peculiarities of democracy and civil society, and we should see how other systems determine and influence functioning of political democracy and civil society. My first concern is about the role of market as the source of the influence of democratic functioning. Poles and many other post-communist societies are not very active in participating in democracy. However, they are pretty active in functioning as market participants. Generally, I would say that Poles are more active as consumers than as citizens. And there are various reasons for it. Actually, the first reason is that Poland, as many other post-communist countries, was encountering very tough and serious economic restructuring, which was, I would say, energy consuming. Social energy was mostly used to cope with these new economic challenges resulting from moving from non-market to market economy. And whole society did particularly well due to the spirit of entrepreneurship of small business class. Actually, these small and medium-sized enterprises are the most important source of the Polish GDP, and this involves massive involvement of social participation in market as small-scale producers. So that's why this energy was used mostly for coping with economic matters. And this is not about passivity of post-communist societies. I would rather support the opinion of shifting way of participation from politics after collapse of communism to economic matters, to market involvement. And that's why society were mostly active in economic matters. And this is the most important reason. The other reason why this market involvement and the market participation is more extensive than political one is of a more universal nature. Generally, we are all surrounded by markets mechanisms, and we are more or less forced to take part in them, while participation in democracy is not an everyday matter. This happens from time to time. So these are two main reasons, one resulting from the tough economic restructuring in post-communist countries, and the second, more universal, which made these societies more involved in the market than in democracy. However, having said that, I would like to stress that I don't think that there is a very strong, clear-cut division, dividing line between market participation and civic participation. I think that sometimes consumer might be closer and closer to citizen. And what I mean here, and the main reason for this, is the fact that we are now witnessing the process of the evolution of consumption. Poland and other post-communist countries are moving from industrial to post-industrial stage of development. And with this evolution, we see that this is consumption of non-material goods as education, access to information, access to culture, access to healthcare, to social security, which are getting more and more important, not the access to pure material goods. So consumption is in a way more and more about access to civic goods. That's why I think that there is not that strong dividing line between being consumer and being citizen. In other words, I think that consumer is getting closer to citizen, and this consumer and market participation could influence citizenship building in the future. That's one of my line of thinking. The other one is that, again, the same thing is with civic participation. The popular view that civil society is pretty weak under post-communist conditions, this country included, is based on the assumption that, as various empirical findings convincingly show, NGOs are not that strong and people are not that actively and extensively participating in them. That's true. There are various statistics confirming that. However, what we should take into account is the fact that there are various other than formal non-governmental organizations, forms of civic participation. What I have in mind here, these are various informal, spontaneous movements and initiatives born very often on the local micro level. Some of them are of a very informal nature, some of them are more or less spontaneous. For example, let's take into account very strong active involvement of Polish society, particularly young generation, in a protest movement against ACTA regulations. So that's the example of this type of new social activeness which goes beyond the formal organizations. That's the example of the phenomenon which was called by one of the Polish sociologists, Professor Andrzej Rychard, handcrafted civil society. I think that we are building this type of civil society which we have to analyze going beyond the formal organizations only. If we focus only on this formal system of non-governmental organizations, then we don't see this new phenomena which I'm talking about. So I'm a bit more optimistic about the functioning of democracy and functioning of civil society. However, to be more optimistic, we have to trespass this borderline, and we have to go beyond the formal borders of politics and beyond the formal borders of civil society in the forms of official organizations. If we broaden the scope of our analysis, if we analyze broader context of the functioning of these organizations, then we see foundations of this optimism. Thank you very much.